Hi, my name is David Warner Matheson, and today I'd like to talk a little about the important zodiac constellation of Libra, the scales or balances. Now is an excellent time of year to find the constellation of Libra in the night sky during late June and on into July and August. So if you've never successfully found Libra, or even if you have, this video will help you to see this constellation and to consider its connection to the world's ancient myths and sacred traditions. So let's look for the constellation Libra. Libra is located directly in front of the constellation Scorpio, which is an extremely large and easy to recognize constellation and one that dominates the sky during the summer months for the Northern Hemisphere. June, July, August. In the Northern Hemisphere, that's the summer. But that dominates the sky during June, July, and August, which is summer for the Northern Hemisphere, winter for the Southern. Right now, at the end of June, Scorpio is highest in the sky just before midnight. For observers in the Northern Hemisphere, that means you'll look towards the southern horizon to see Scorpio, and for observers in the Southern Hemisphere, you'll look towards the northern horizon. For viewers in the Northern Hemisphere, Scorpio will reach its highest altitude above the southern horizon as it goes over the due south line, as we see in the star chart shown here. For Southern Hemisphere, it's the highest altitude when it's crossing the due north line. Everything is reversed that I'm saying. Due to our progress throughout the year in Earth's relationship to the sun, the background stars rise a few minutes earlier each night, which means they get farther along their path by a few minutes each night. And for stars along the zodiac band, they will rise about 4 minutes earlier each night. So that means that Scorpio will reach this highest point crossing the due south line a few minutes earlier each night. So to see Scorpio, as shown here at its highest point, a month from now, you only need to wait until about 9:40 in the evening. Scorpio has a distinctive shape and a very high percentage of bright stars, so it's relatively easy to find. It's a big, graceful constellation, and it looks like a long letter S, a very graceful, cursive kind of S. Or it could also be envisioned as a stretched out letter J. The tail of Scorpio has a distinctive barbed stinger right here, beginning at these two stars known as the cat's eyes. That's where the stinger kind of bends away from the sinuous S shape of the rest of the body. These two stars are known as the cat's eyes, and then so there's a barbed tail beyond the cat's eyes, and then from there it curves up towards the head area of the constellation, where we find the bright red star Antares up in the near the heads of the scorpion. The bright red star Antares is sometimes envisioned as the heart of the scorpion, and then stretching on to the stars that could be envisioned as either the claws of the scorpion or alternately as multiple heads, which is how this constellation often appears in ancient myth. Often appears as a serpent or a dragon with multiple heads. The brightest four stars of the heads are fairly easy to see, and if you can see these, then it will help you as you're looking for the constellation Libra, which will be just in front of Scorpio, just to the west of Scorpio. Libra represents a traditional two-pan balance, or Libra, the stars of Libra are envisioned as this traditional balance, set of balances. It's a type of mechanical balance consisting of a cross beam from which are suspended two measuring pans, typically suspended by light chains from either end of the cross beam, the measuring beam. The beam itself is suspended across a fulcrum point in the center, allowing the comparison of mass between objects placed in one pan versus objects placed in the other pan. So we'll see that Libra in the sky has this pattern. It has a triangular upper section that is envisioned as the cross beam with the fulcrum represented by the star at the upper point of that triangular top part of the constellation of Libra. So from this triangular top, then you can envision two chains descending to stars below either end of the beam, representing the two weighing pans that are suspended by the chains from each end of the crossbeam. Libra is actually a large constellation itself, but it doesn't have bright stars the way Scorpio does, and therefore it can be one of the more challenging zodiac constellations to locate. The two brightest stars of Libra are the two that form two of the corners of that triangular upper part. The triangular part that I said is the upper beam and the fulcrum point in the center above the beam. So using the Bayer designation, sometimes it's pronounced Bayer, devised by Johann Bayer in 1603, these two stars are today primarily known as Alpha Librae and Beta Librae. Johann Bayer came up with a system where you name the stars basically in order of brightness, A, B, of the constellation. So for Libra, they're called Alpha Librae and Beta Librae, which means the alpha and the beta of the constellation Libra. Librae being the genitive or possessive Latin form of Libra. So it means Libra's alpha, or the alpha of Libra, or the alpha belonging to Libra, Alpha Librae. The Arabic names for these two brightest stars, given by the Arabic astronomers in previous centuries, are Zuban el-Janubi and Zuban Shamali for the second brightest, which is Beta Librae. And those names in Arabic mean the southern claw, Zuban el-Janubi, that's the brighter one, Alpha Librae, and the northern claw, Zuban Shamali. You can find YouTube videos which confidently tell you that these stars of Libra were originally considered to be part of the constellation Scorpio, and that's why they got these names of being the claws. But then later on, Julius Caesar supposedly, quote, lopped off the scales, lopped off the claws of the scorpion when he rearranged all the constellations to create the scales of justice constellation to immortalize Roman law. Well, even though you can find YouTube videos that tell you that, that can be shown to be completely false. This constellation Libra was around long before Julius Caesar. I can show you, I have shown in some of my books, that the constellation Libra plays a role in the events of the Odyssey of ancient Greece, long before the time of Caesar. And we'll see some other examples in this video which show that this constellation was recognized in extremely ancient times and seen in this same outline that we're showing here long before the Romans came onto the scene. But to complete the outline of the scales of Libra, you need to find the third star in that triangular upper part of the constellation, which has the Bayer designation of Gamma Librae. So there's the triangle is Alpha Librae, Beta Librae, and Gamma Librae. So just remember that that third one is much fainter than Alpha and Beta Librae, or much fainter than Zuban el-Janubi and Zuban Shamali. It's the point of the triangle that's closest to the scorpion. So Zuban Shamali, or Beta Librae, is at the top of the triangle, representing the fulcrum point. Zuban el-Janubi, or Alpha Librae, is at one end of the crossbeam, the western side. That's the right side if you're in the northern hemisphere facing to the south. And then Gamma Librae forms the other end of the crossbeam, the eastern side, or the left if you're looking at it with the fulcrum on top, if you're looking at it facing south in the northern hemisphere. Hopefully that makes sense. So once you've found this triangular upper part of the scales, then it's a fairly easy matter to trace out the lines down to the two weighing pans below either end of the crossbeam. But these are pretty faint stars down there. But if you If you just trace down from either end of the crossbeam, you'll find them. You have to get to a pretty dark area, block out lights. If you've got any, if there's a street light or something, you probably want to get outside of the city to where there are no street lights. But if there are any lights, you have to block them out with your arm to be able to see Libra. But once you've got that triangular upper part, then going down from either end brings you to the two pans of the balances, the weighing pans. So on the western side, the weighing pan on that side is represented by a single star below Zubin el-Janubi, or Alpha Librae. And you can imagine this chain stretching down between Alpha Librae and the star that forms the western pan of the scales of Libra on that side. And then on the eastern side, the side closest to Scorpio, the weighing pan over on that side is actually a bit lower down than on the western side. They're not exactly in balance, but they're close. And it's represented by two stars, one above the other, fairly close to one another, and they're down so far that they're actually even a bit lower than the lowest of the four bright stars in the front of Scorpio. I think of those as four of the multiple heads of Scorpio. So the scales of Libra are right in front of Scorpio, and they're so large that they actually, the weighing pans go almost down below Scorpio, just below the fourth head of the four bright stars that you can see most easily. There's a lot of stars there, so you can envision even more heads. But the four brightest stars of the heads, the weighing pan on the Scorpio side is almost even to it, but even a tiny bit further south than that. So when you're looking for Libra in the night sky, you first want to trace out that upper triangular part representing the beam and the fulcrum at the top, and then find the balancing pans below either end of the beam. And remember that they go very far down. It's a large constellation. They go down actually just below the stars at the front of Scorpio, particularly on that east side of Libra. And that part of Libra is actually very close to the front of Scorpio. And that fact should help you locate the constellation Libra in the night sky. Now, as I've demonstrated previously, the figure of Libra is very important for confirming the interpretation of figures nearby in the heavens. For example, here's an artist's depiction of the archangel Michael defeating the dragon who's introduced in Revelation chapter 12, in which the dragon is described as having 7 heads and 10 horns, and in which Michael and his angels are described as fighting against the dragon and casting him out. I have explained in other places, in some books and in other videos, that in these verses, the dragon with the 7 heads and 10 horns can be positively identified with the constellation Scorpio, which appears as a great serpent with multiple heads in many ancient myths around the world. Another one is when Scorpio plays the role of the Lernaean Hydra, which the hero Heracles or Hercules must fight in one of his 12 labors in the myths of ancient Greece or Rome. In that myth, the Hydra had 9 heads. In the Revelation 12 account, the dragon has 7 heads, and that just shows you that Scorpio often plays serpent figures with multiple heads, sometimes 7, sometimes 9, and in other myths it's 8 or other numbers. Michael the archangel is almost invariably depicted as standing on the dragon, as he is here in this painting by Bartolomeo Vivarini from the 1400s. And I have explained and demonstrated that this positioning of Michael right above the dragon is due to the fact that Michael can be positively identified with the towering figure of another constellation directly above Scorpio, the constellation Ophiuchus. Ophiuchus, in fact, appears to be standing upon Scorpio. Now, this interpretation is strengthened by the fact that Michael is often depicted holding a spear. And Ophiuchus figures frequently have a spear as their weapon. When they do have a weapon, it's often a spear. And that's because the constellation itself consists of a tall central body, which looks like a rectangle topped with a triangle. And that central body is flanked in the sky by stars which represent what are called the two serpent halves on either side of that central body. And they're sometimes envisioned as serpents, but they're envisioned as all kinds of other things. And sometimes they're envisioned as either one spear, or in some cases actually two spears. So when you see a figure in ancient myth wielding two spears, such as Hector in the Iliad of ancient Greece, that's a pretty strong clue that that figure is associated with the constellation Ophiuchus, which Hector actually is. In this case, we see that Vivarini has shown Michael with a spear in one hand, and on the opposite side from the spear, the archangel is holding a set of balancing scales. So this feature of artwork depicting Michael and the dragon is actually a very common characteristic of these depictions. These depictions of Michael and the dragon in that scene from Revelation 12 often show Michael holding a weapon in one hand and a set of balances in the other. And that is proof positive that my interpretation of the multi-headed dragon being associated with Scorpio and Michael being associated with Ophiuchus was understood at some point in previous centuries. In previous centuries, they also appear to have come to this same interpretation of the celestial foundation of this scene. Can you see how the scales held by Michael are in a position in the painting to indicate the location of the scales of Libra in the night sky relative to Ophiuchus and to Scorpio? So what's really interesting, another really interesting aspect of this depiction, or of these characteristics when Michael and the dragon are depicted in this Revelation 12 battle, is we can often see the dragon, or the devil, underneath Michael's feet, actually pulling down on one of the pans of the balances in the painting. There's a verse in Revelation 12 where the dragon is explicitly identified as Satan, and that's why when Michael's battling the dragon, sometimes the dragon looks like a dragon with multiple heads, sometimes it looks like a devil figure, sometimes with multiple heads, sometimes not. But that figure underneath Michael will often be pulling down one side of the scales. And which side of the scales appears to be lower in the heavens, in the actual constellation? Well, it's that side of the constellation that's closer to the stars of Scorpio. Just as if Scorpio, or the figure associated with Scorpio, is pulling down on that side of the scales, trying to tip the balances. Now, in other depictions of this scene of Michael and the dragon, sometimes you'll have the artist draw in an angel kind of lifting up the other side of the balances to counteract the action of the devil pulling down on the balances. Those who are familiar with ancient myth from other cultures may recognize a pattern here, which is also found in depictions of the scales used in the famous weighing of the heart scene in ancient Egypt. Here's an example of that scene from the scroll of the scribe Ani. This scroll was buried with Ani and contains the texts and illustrations from the text known as the Book of Going Forth by Day. And in modern times, it's been given the name and is often called the Book of the Dead because of a label given to it by its first modern translator, Carl Richard Lepsius, who lived from 1810 to 1884. He called it the Book of the Dead when he translated it, and that's the way it's usually labeled today. But in ancient times, they called it the Book of Going Forth by Day, or the Book of Coming Forth by Day. And the scribes would prepare these beautiful copies of that text. And Ani was a scribe. We don't know if he actually drew this text of the Book of Going Forth by Day that was buried with him, or if someone else did, but it is rightly regarded as one of the most beautiful copies of the Book of the Dead to have survived that we know of at this time. So in this scene, Ani's heart is being weighed on the balance against the feather of Maat. I would argue that the balance in this case is actually associated with the figure of Ophiuchus in the heavens, which can also be envisioned as a balance. And in fact, it also has a triangular top, very similar to the triangular top of the constellation Libra. And in the case of Ophiuchus, we can envision a heart on one side and a feather on the other. Remember those two flanking serpent halves of Ophiuchus. The head of the serpent could be envisioned as a heart on one side of the balance, and the tail could be envisioned as the feather on the other side of the balance. The important aspect of this image here is that we brought it up to show that Ophiuchus can also play the scales. Ophiuchus and Libra are clearly closely associated, but in this scene from the Book of the Dead, we have the scales also being helped out, just like in those depictions from the Archangel Michael. In the weighing of the heart scene, we have the figure of Anubis helping Ani by making sure that the heart does not outweigh the feather. The deeds of the heart are being measured against the feather of truth, or the feather of balance, the feather of Maat. And Anubis is helping Ani out just in case his heart has gathered up too many things that might put it out of balance. Anubis is helping a little bit by putting a little extra weight there on the side of the fulcrum with the feather to help it balance with the heart. In his essential 1940 text entitled Lost Light, Alvin Boyd Kuhn explores the esoteric meaning of ancient myth, and he dives into the significance of this particular scene in great depth, devoting actually an entire chapter to it and going into the importance of the scales of judgment and bringing in the scales of Libra and discussing this whole concept of judgment. And he shows beyond doubt that this judgment of the soul does not take place at death or after death, but rather during this incarnate life. Kuhn writes, Orthodox religionism and popular belief must receive with what composure they can the forthright declaration that the judgment scene is enacted on this earth, not in the life or spirit following our sojourn here. We are in the scales of the judgment now, for we are also in Hades, Sheol, Amenta now. Neither above man with the angels, nor below him with the beasts, does moral responsibility reside. It inheres solely in the kingdom of man, who is poised, the only creature in evolution so placed, on the two arms of the balance between mind and matter. Man on the horizon is not only nailed on the cross of matter, he is being weighed in the scales of the balance to see if his heart is so spiritualized as to be light as a feather, man's heart against a feather, and his fate hanging thereon. The entire chapter, of course, is well worth reading, and indeed the entire volume of Lost Light from 1940, which is available in its entirety online, and there's a link to it in the resources section of my website. Obviously, the figures of Ophiuchus and of Libra were often used in conjunction with one another in the worldwide system of celestial metaphor which underlies the ancient myths. I've also previously demonstrated that the constellation Libra is held by other Ophiuchus figures in the sacred traditions of other cultures, such as in this artwork from the ancient Mesopotamian kingdom of Assyria, thought to date to the middle of the 9th century BC. This particular piece of artwork is thought to date to the middle of the 9th century BC. By the way, this is, again, well before the time of Julius Caesar, right? This artwork is showing a winged Apkallu, a figure known as an apkallu, a divine figure like an angel in some ways. And again, like the angels that we discussed earlier, we'll see that it's associated with Ophiuchus. Note that the apkallu is holding an egg-shaped or a pine cone-shaped object in one hand, raised around eye level, and then is also holding a satchel-shaped bag or bucket or purse or wallet in the lower hand. This apkallu is another Ophiuchus figure. The upraised egg is the same serpent head feature, corresponds to that same serpent head feature from the constellation, which we saw playing the role of the heart being weighed against the feather. But in this case, the serpent tail that played the feather is envisioned as the wings, the actual wings of the apkallu. But what celestial feature could possibly be playing the role of the bucket or the satchel held by this apkallu figure? Well, we've already seen the scales being held by a different Ophiuchus figure, the archangel Michael. But this time, and we saw that was clearly associated with the constellation Libra. This time, instead of playing the role of a set of balances, the constellation Libra is envisioned as this bag or bucket held in the exact same location that the scales were being held by the archangel Michael when he was standing atop the dragon of Scorpio. Here's another apkallu, a different one, also from Assyria, also from the 9th century BC, showing another Ophiuchus figure in the same outline, holding up an egg or a pine cone-shaped object in the upper hand and holding the same type of satchel or bucket in the lower hand. And this bucket or satchel or purse or bag is an artistic feature that is found in other ancient artwork around the world and has sparked a lot of commentary and a lot of speculation among researchers of ancient civilization, especially by those researchers whom I respect very much, who are pointing out the overwhelming evidence for ancient connections which span the globe, connections which cannot be explained by the conventional paradigm of ancient history, and connections which are generally ignored by mainstream academia because they can't explain them away. Or if they try, they say, well, they're not connected in any way. It's just coincidence. But here's an image from Olmec culture, from the ancient Olmec of Central America. This is from a stela found at the site known today as La Venta in present-day Mexico, along the Gulf of Mexico. The Olmec civilization stretches back to at least 1800 BC, or BCE if you prefer, which means that this stela, known as the La Venta stela number 19, comes from a civilization as old as the Mesopotamian artwork that we've just seen, or perhaps the stela may even be older than the artwork we were just looking at. The outline of the bag or satchel is almost identical to those that we saw from the artwork from ancient Assyria. Now, this stela depicts a feathered serpent. In fact, it's thought to be the earliest known depiction of the feathered serpent deity in the Americas, at least the earliest depiction that we know of so far. Notably, again, I've presented abundant evidence in my book, The Ancient Worldwide System, and elsewhere, which argues that the feathered serpent deities of the Americas are also associated with the constellation Ophiuchus. And here we have a satchel, which is associated with Ophiuchus figures in other cultures all the way on the other side of the globe, around the world, and it's also with this feathered serpent figure. So whatever else this satchel signifies, the evidence should be very clear that it corresponds to the constellation of Libra in the night sky. But that fact only becomes apparent once we begin to unlock the celestial code underlying the ancient myths of cultures around the globe, cultures on every inhabited continent and island. And this system forms a common foundation for all of them, including those ancient myths that are collected into what we call the Bible. In this ancient worldwide system, the figures of the constellations were imbued with esoteric significance. They were given meaning. They acted like a code or a set of hieroglyphs in the sky, a set of signifiers that had to do with esoteric concepts, profound concepts, and this cycle of our plunge down into this incarnate life. They act as position markers within the great heavenly cycles, and those cycles themselves serve to represent truths about this incarnate life in which we presently find ourselves, as Alvin Boyd Kuhn explains in the chapters of Lost Light that I referenced a little bit earlier and throughout his book, Lost Light. And he also talks about how the balances of Libra have to do with a state of equilibrium and balance. And in my own work, I have found undeniable evidence that the figure of Ophiuchus holds tremendous significance within this ancient worldwide system. Now, Alvin Boyd Kuhn doesn't really talk about Ophiuchus. He talks about Libra. But I've just shown that Ophiuchus and Libra often go together. And the figure of Ophiuchus in this ancient worldwide system often portrays for us, signifies, and depicts for us the role of the higher self, the divine self. And so the fact that Ophiuchus figures are often holding something representative of the balances of Libra seems to convey to us an important message about the characteristics of this self, about balance and self. And the ancient myths show us that we become divided from self, from our own self. We even become alienated from our own self during this life. But the ancient myths also show and teach that we can become reconciled and reconnected with self. In fact, I'm convinced that this recovery of self is absolutely central to the message of the world's myths. So I hope that this video will be helpful to you in seeing the constellation Libra for yourself, and that the ancient message that Libra conveys will be helpful to you in your own journey. Thank you so much for watching and for your interest in the precious treasure given to us in the world's ancient myths.